So here's what we're going to look at first. We're going to give you just an overall sketch of how bad is it. How many of you have been very concerned, especially in the last year, especially since this last election, about media bias? Okay, let's have an informal survey. How many think the media tend to move to the left? I'll tell you what, as Julie said, I spent many, many years as a reporter in Detroit, primarily in TV, sometime in radio before I went into the Christian media. But I was never so ashamed to admit that I was in the secular media than I was last fall, because that was not reporting. That was sheer propaganda. Sheer propaganda. And I don't care who you voted for. Well, I do, but that's a whole other presentation. But you didn't get the truth. You did not get the truth about any of the candidates. That's why so many people were surprised when this whole issue of Notre Dame came up. And don't get me started on that one. Listen to this. I was there for that whole thing. They didn't realize how extreme our current president is in terms of, well, all the issues, but abortion. One good thing that came out of Notre Dame for the first time, this issue was associated with the administration. They were able to skate by in the election because the reporters wanted him in office because they truly believe in his agenda, and they wanted to keep all of this negative stuff down. It's out in the open. Amen? All right, let's look at some of the situation with the media in terms of media bias. The accuracy rating of the news media has hit a new 2-decade low in terms of people believing in the accuracy of the media. 60% in a Pew Research Center poll said the media, I'm shocked and appalled, have a strong liberal bias. As my nieces would say, shut up. 64% of Americans believe the news and entertainment media help lead to an overall decline in morality in America. You think? I think so. Nearly 9 out of 10 Americans believe journalists often let their personal views influence the way they report the news. 5 more times journalists describe themselves as liberal than conservative. One survey last fall by the Pew Research Center for People in the Press found that voters, regardless of whether they were Democratic, Republican, or Independent, believed that the media wanted the liberal candidates to win, and this was by a margin of 70 to 9%. A 2005 study showed nearly half of all Americans attend weekly church services once a week or more, but less than 17% of journalists across the country do. And media outlets, including the Los Angeles Times, require news staff to use the terms anti-abortion and pro-choice. Now, why do you think that is? Because we are Americans and we love our choice. So if you're pro-choice, then you must be good. But if you're anti, you're bad. Heaven forbid they should call us what we really are, and that is pro-life. A few examples of recent media bias. How many of you are familiar with the story that happened not too far away from here, the shooting death of James Pulliam, the pro-life activist near Lansing, Michigan? Now, his shooting death, happened on September 11th. So as a news person, I realized that the story is going to be somewhat pushed on the back burner because of the size of the story of September 11th. It's still huge because terrorism is still a major issue. However, let me tell you something. If it had been George Tiller that had been killed on September 11th versus James Pulliam, then the story would have gotten much bigger play. James Pulliam was known as the sign guy in the central Michigan area. He was very good friends with one of my friends from Citizens for a Pro-Life Society, Monica Miller, in southeastern Michigan. He had some health issues, but he never let that stop him. He was always out at certain locations. Usually he'd stay at one place for a little while. I never met him. I just heard about him through Citizens for a Pro-Life Society. But he would sit there with his signs day after day after day, so he was known as a sign guy. ABC News' Charlie Gibson described him as a polarizing figure in the pro-life movement. George Tiller was painted as a saint and a hero for women's rights. Now, all the pro-life groups, the major pro-life groups, came out right away and spoke up against the killing of George Tiller, because murder is murder. And they spoke out and they said, this is wrong. Not one pro-abortion group came out. There was one statement that was on one smaller pro-abortion group that was on their website. But we didn't hear from NARAL, we didn't hear from NOW, we didn't hear from any of these groups coming out and saying that the shooting death of James Pulliam was wrong, nor did the media look for it. The media didn't report the healthcare reform abortion connection until they were exposed by several Christian media outlets, including LifeSite News and LifeNews.com. Since then, AP, Time, FactCheck.org are now all admitting that abortion is still part of the current healthcare plan that's before us in Congress. Now, this is one that really, as I like to say, gets my Italian up. The March for Life. This past year, we had 300,000 people, they estimate, in Washington. How can anybody ignore that amount of people on such an issue that is still so divisive as abortion? The amazing thing is, a lot of us, and I cover it for EWTN, and I'll be doing the same thing in January, a lot of us are wondering how many people would show up just because of the logistics. You're thinking, okay, it's 2 days after the inauguration, there's still going to be barriers up, people are going to think, maybe it's just going to be too difficult for me to get around. But it was the largest we ever had. You know how the media reported? Both sides on the pro-abortion debate, on the abortion debate, showed up in Washington. Excuse me? 300,000 versus maybe 20? Every year, I not only cover the march, but I also end up at the Supreme Court for the rally with Silent No More Awareness. One of my good friends, Janet Morana, is a co-founder of Silent No More Awareness. The media show up around 5 o'clock at the end of the day, and they completely ignore Silent No More Awareness, where women and men are getting up, dozens, giving their incredibly moving post-abortion testimony. Then you have 20, maybe 30 tops, Planned Parenthood, and NARAL Now, circulating with their little, keep your rosaries off my, ovaries and my body, my choice, and that whole bit. And the media, and I know exactly what they're doing. They get the photographers together, and they tell the group to make a tight circle, and then they zoom in. And so the camera shot looks like it's a very large or very enthusiastic crowd. And so the image that you get, and I know the tricks. I've been in the business for almost 30 years. You got to remember this. I'm thinking as a street reporter who worked regularly with a photographer and looking at angles and looking at things, and I know what can happen in terms of the way you shoot an image. And so they give this message by showing in this very tight circle the pro-abortion signs and protesters, and then you zoom out and you just maybe show one little group of pro-lifers. So it gives people the same impression that the same size crowd was there. It's ridiculous. It's a lie. And this is if they even bothered to show up and cover it. How can this be? If it wasn't for EWTN and Christian media outlets, we wouldn't even know the March for Life happened. Drives me absolutely crazy. And so if you start thinking about this, just a few of these statistics that I'm giving you on media bias, and we haven't even gotten to the other stuff yet, you have to remember